Windsor-Essex. You're listening to We Talk History on the WePodcast network. I'm your host, Jordan Pope, and today's episode is very special. Today, we're going to talk about 20th century Canadian military history, specifically the contribution of our veterans from the Windsor-Essex area. Some of our country's finest have come from this area and fought Canada's enemies in the First World War, Second World War, the Korean War, the Yugoslav Wars, and the war in Afghanistan. Initially, I was going to focus our second episode on the Windsor campaign of the Patriot War, but considering the time of year, I think that it was most appropriate to discuss our veterans. I promise that we will revisit this topic in a future episode. If you haven't listened to the first episode of the series, please listen to it. I think you'll enjoy it very much. We introduce the concept of the show and talk about the origins of our area, Windsor and Essex County. Anyways, let's begin the second episode of We Talk History. So, before the First World War began, Canada was a very young country, a dominion of the British Empire. And if that empire were to ever go at war, Canada would follow them. And this is what happened in 1914 when the First World War began. A Serbian nationalist executed Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which caused many different countries to declare war on each other, and eventually it became a global conflict. Now, we all know the stories and the big battles that involve Canada, but what many don't know, especially in this area, is the stories of our veterans, what our local regiments had gone through during that conflict. So, the 18th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces was created, and it drew soldiers from many other different regiments and militia units that existed before the war began. And they went overseas in April of 1915 and into the front trenches on September 27th as part of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. So, to me, it seems very crazy that, you're part of a militia or a regiment at home, probably as a part of a reserve unit, and really the last thing you'd ever expect is for the government to call you up and send you overseas. Obviously, we had conscription at the time as well. So that made things probably very life-changing for these people. And again, we've had many, many people from our area, thousands, fight in that war. Now, obviously what followed was trench warfare. But first, of course, they went to Valcartier and trained while they were in the reserve. The 18th Battalion got much better with experience and participated in every action of the 2nd Division. Notably the Battle of the Somme, Vimy Ridge, Hill 70, and of course the Battle of Passchendaele, and the final 100 Days offensive as well. So, obviously, it's very cool that such skilled soldiers and really a great regiment was able to come together and fight in our most important battles. We never really get to hear the stories of how our local people go over and fight when, we learned about in history class. We learned about Canada's history, but we don't really talk about Windsor-Essex, which I believe should be discussed more in our classrooms. Well, a lot of people, because of this awesome regiment, won awards. Awards like the Victoria Cross for some of these people. Most notably, Sergeant Ellis Sifton of Wallstown was awarded this for his heroic action at Vimy Ridge on April 19th, 1917. He single-handedly charged an enemy machine gun, which had been holding up his company's advance, and killed all the crew, the entire crew of German soldiers. He then held off the enemy until his comrades had captured their objective. He was killed during the fighting, which you can imagine probably was very overwhelming for the single soldier. And the 18th Battalion was awarded 18 battle honors for its involvement in the war, and is perpetuated by the Essex Fusiliers. So, we already had pretty much a very big impact in the First World War, and of course, we always talk about Canada's impact, and it's very cool to know that people from our area in Windsor-Essex also had their own impact. So, of course, following the war, our side was victorious So when our soldiers came home, the regiment was disbanded, the battalion was disbanded, and again, we basically focused on peacetime. There was not an expectation for there to be another war. World War I, or the Great War, has also been called the war to end all wars. So when the German Empire fell, the last thing these people expected was to go back to war again, or for the country to go back to war again. And well, this battalion, which eventually became the Essex Scottish Regiment, went to war again in September of 1939, when the British declared war on Germany for the invasion of Poland. Some people were ready and some people were not, as there was a lot of build-up to the Second World War. In 16 days of recruiting, 27 officers and 812 other ranks were enlisted. Preliminary training was done at the St. Luke Road Barracks in Windsor, and in May 1940, moved to Camp Borden under the command of Lieutenant Colonel A.S. Peterson. The 1st Battalion of the Essex Scottish Regiment left Halifax on July 23rd and reached England on August 2nd, settling into the Maida Barracks in Aldershot. Now, the Scottish carried out many training exercises during that time, mostly emphasizing coastal defense in the south of England, as the threat of invasion heightened. Of course, the fall of France was occurring that year, and the Nazi Germany was basically expanding their empire to the seas, and that was very scary for a lot of people at that time, and many thought that Britain was next. And it was a very, very scary time for many of those people in England. However, the Essex Regiment was not called into active service until August 1940. Now, one of the most notable battles of the Second World War, not just for our area, but for our country, took place during the Dieppe Raid. Of course, we were not victorious during that time, but again, Windsor-Essex had their impact during that time. And this was under the command of F.K. Jasperson, Lieutenant Colonel in the Canadian Army. And basically, there was a planned invasion so that the Allies could somehow wedge themselves into Nazi-occupied Europe. The raid was cancelled once, but revived again a month later. So Operation Jubilee was the code word for the Dieppe raid and commenced under the cover of Exercise Ford on August 18th, when the battalion boarded assault landing aircraft at Southampton and Portsmouth. Obviously, as we read in our history textbooks, there were heavy casualties at the time, as the Germans had very strong defenses for the battle. Many were killed, and many more were actually captured. And it was actually over very quick for the Scottish at 06:30 hours. Some were wounded as well. And although the Canadians may have lost this battle, I think it shows how strong we really are, that the other nations of the Allied alliance would trust Canada with such an offensive, since we were, a very small country at the time. And I'm very proud of our country, although we lost that battle. And I'm very proud of our area as well for having such a great impact on that. Now, following that defeat at Dieppe, Lieutenant J.H. Mothersill assumed command of the Essex Scottish Regiment and wanted to rebuild, reorganize, and train. And when he assumed command on May 23rd, 1943, he continued training in England and Scotland. Exercises were a constant fear of military routine, with the occasional highlight such as a battalion march past and bid farewell to W.E. Potts in July, and the winning of the Brigade Sports Day on December 1st. The Essex Scottish returned to France in July of 1944, landing at La Valette to exploit the D-Day landing of June 6th. The first casualties and capture of prisoners took place on July 11th. Intensive fighting around Ifs and, excuse me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Bourgebus Ridge on July 21st to July 22nd resulted in 281 casualties. So very, very heavy casualties again for the regiment. On July 29th, under a new commanding officer once more, Lieutenant Colonel T.S. Jones, the Essex Scottish again pushed forward, and this time were successful. 6 received bravery awards for their action that day. And the next battle, for Follette, involved the Essex Scottish on the 7th and 8th to August in a night attack against the Germans. We were very successful, and the German resistance lessened as we battled on later on in the war in 1944. And the Essex Scottish actually returned to Dieppe, this time on September 3rd, 1944, as heroes. They paused at the graves of those who had fallen in 1942 and took a divisional march past and toured the killing grounds. So this had to be a very, very emotional moment for a lot of these soldiers at the time, because it was only 2 years prior that all of this terrible battle for the Canadians had occurred, and many of their friends and other people that in the regiment had suffered were wounded and killed and captured. So I think it's very cool that these people were able to come back this time after a victory and pay their respects. I can't imagine losing someone close to me, and it's very, very cool, and I think it's nice that they were able to pay their respects. Now, following that, on the 20th of September, in Belgium, a large German fighting patrol got into D Company's area, and in the action, Lieutenant Colonel Bennett was wounded. On September 26th, another commanding officer by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Pangman joined the unit as CO. For the next month, the battalion was involved in the deadly fighting to clear South Beveland and allow the opening of the Scheldt estuary to the port of Antwerp. Now, much-needed supplies could be easily brought to the Allied armies if they were able to take this spot. Christmas was spent, and this is in 1944, in the line east of Groesbeek, listening to enemy broadcasts of Christmas carols. New Year's was spent in reserve, near Boxtel. Then it was back to Groesbeek again, and patrols probing the German positions at this time. Now, the battalion continued on into German territory, and on February 18th, launched an attack in a German region. The mud limited the movement of infantry tanks, and after a successful attack, the Germans had heavy casualties, however still were determined to come back with a counterattack of tanks and infantry. If it wasn't for A Company of the regiment, led by K.W. McIntyre, and the anti-tank guns, the position would have definitely been lost for the Allies. The battalion had suffered 150 deaths and many more wounded in just those 2 days. Now, on the morning of March 1st, as part of divisional operation, the battalion assaulted the Hockwald Forest with 2 companies moving forward. Despite withering machine gun fire, artillery, and strong German defenses, C Company, commanded by Acting Major General Fred Tilson, was able to gain a foothold and allow the other companies to solidify the position. Now, the major ended up making 6 trips to get ammunition for his men and was wounded 3 times, including serious injuries to both legs. So, you have to imagine the courage this guy had to make 6 trips and get wounded 3 times, and seriously in both legs. And yet he still kept going back for ammunition more and more times for the safety of his men. And that definitely led to an award for his great leadership and a lot of respect from his men. I think that was a very, very brave thing that Major Tilson did. Now, the next operation was the capture of Xanten on March 8th, and this wasn't much easier with 119 casualties compared to 138 at Hockwald. It seems like almost every one of these battles that the regiment is involved in, there's always over 100 deaths or very close. Even in the victories that they have, their best victories, they just seem to lose so many guys. And I can't imagine that's very good for morale, but they kept pushing forward. That's got to be very difficult. Now, after a period of rest, the battalion was moved back into Holland. Of course, this was during the liberation of the Netherlands. and the enemy was in retreat as we are approaching the final days of the war. The Essex Scottish captured the bridge into the old town of Groningen. Then it was back into Germany, and by April 23rd, the battalion was on the Bremen-Oldenburg Road, on the banks of the canal near Oldenburg. C Company of the Essex Scottish Regiment accepted the surrender of 9 officers and 351 other ranks. Those are German soldiers. Hostilities ceased at 0800 hours on May 5th. Lieutenant Colonel Pangman returned from hospital but was recalled to Canada on May 17th. The Scottish finished the war under command of Lieutenant Colonel K.W. McIntyre, the last of its original officers from September 1939. During the brief occupation of the battalion, was visited by many senior officers, including Lieutenant Colonel J.E. McCorkle. He was CO of the 2nd Reserve Battalion, and of course Lieutenant Colonel Jasperson. I think we mentioned Jasperson before, and he was the CO during the Dieppe raid. The 1st Battalion of the Scottish returned to Canada and was disbanded on December 15th, with the dubious record of having the highest number of casualties of any unit in the Canadian Army. So like I mentioned before, they had so many people die after every one of these battles, over 100. And that ended up totaling 553 deaths and roughly 2,000 wounded. So there's a fact that not a lot of people know. And maybe we should discuss that more. How so many people, and the most of any regiment, 553 deaths for a regiment out of our own area. I think that's very significant. Maybe we should respect that more. The Essex Scottish was awarded 18 battle honours for its involvement in the war, which I'm not very surprised because they were obviously very, very involved in that conflict. Now, the Kent Regiment, which was a part of the Essex Scots, I believe, did not go overseas as a unit, but was on active duty for coastal defence in Nova Scotia and British Columbia, and a power station guard near the Niagara Falls. This was after the war ended in 1945. So, again, there was peacetime, and many of the soldiers obviously left because many of them were volunteers during the conflict. However, the regiment did stay active. They acted as a reserve unit effectively, and that continued to the Korean War. And although the entire regiment itself did not go overseas and serve, there were many volunteers from that regiment that volunteered to go over, which is very cool. The Windsor Regiment became allied with a reconnaissance regiment from Great Britain, later to become the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards in 1971. However, we'll get to this in a second. So many of those few volunteers in the Korean War did their service, and they trained at Camp Petawawa and Camp Meaford to conduct gun camps and maintenance, among other tasks. Now, following the war in 1963, the regiment had a debate and would receive infantry colours, or whether or not, they would receive infantry colours or a cavalry guidon. Now, effective March 1st, 1965, the regiment was converted back to reconnaissance. So that was another thing I've noticed throughout this as well. There are so many different tasks and functions that this regiment basically had to go back and forth. They were infantry, and like I said, they were reconnaissance. They were many different things, and that's what makes this regiment so great, in my opinion, is, not only did they, suffer a lot of casualties, and they did very great things during both World Wars and the Korean War, but also the fact that they're so well-rounded, and they can do everything from reconnaissance to infantry and many other different things. Now, throughout the 1970s, I think they supported operations during the Montreal Olympics. Of course, that was 1976. Obviously, that's a very big event, so they served there for a time, and they also helped during severe winter storms in southwestern Ontario during the 1970s. And I believe they went to Germany during the 1970s for training exercises, which happen all the time. I know now the Canadian Army is always going overseas to Europe and many various places around the world to train and conduct training missions with other nations. So they've been doing this for a very long time. I'm not sure if the Windsor Regiment is still doing that, going overseas for training missions, but I know that that is still practice for other regiments throughout the country. So throughout the 1980s, the regiment trained for the Cougar armored vehicle, which had a 3-man crew. Training was divided into driving, and maintenance and gunnery, and armored tactics. Although deemed a tank trainer by the Corps, the Cougars saw action in Bosnia and Somalia. So, of course, I don't know if many listeners remember, but there was a conflict during the 1990s in Yugoslavia, that region in Eastern Europe. And so, during that time, many Canadians, including ones from the Windsor Regiment, went and volunteered their services overseas again. So that is very impressive as well, and they were very, very successful over there. The regiment also sent 2 troops to support regular forces operations in Cambodia, and 7 more in that region, like I said, in Bosnia. Now, to date, the regiment was changed once again from an armored role to reconnaissance in 1997. And as of 2011, when this information came out, more than 24 members have deployed on Canada's operations in Afghanistan. I know a man named Corporal Grennan from Windsor actually passed away. He was killed in action from a Taliban attack, and I think it was 2008. So again, we still, even today, we're still suffering many casualties when it comes to the troops in our area. And so I think we all need to realize that these conflicts around the world are still happening, and people from our area continue to step up and pay the ultimate sacrifice. And that's why I think this Remembrance Day is so important. And that's because it still happens today. It's been happening for many years, where we have people going overseas and sacrificing themselves. And I think it's very inspiring, and I can speak for myself when I say I'm very thankful that for what they've done for my country and for my freedom. Now, that's about all we have today for this episode. I hope that this has been an educational experience for you, as it was for me. I learned many great things about not only the local regiments, but even the war itself, reading into this. The Daya Parade was very significant for Canada, and it's just so cool to see it all come together when we have local regiments involved as well. I think that's awesome. And I just want to remind everyone, because it is Remembrance Week, it's very important to remember and appreciate our veterans. Not only on Remembrance Week or Remembrance Day, but every day. So thank you for listening again, and lest we forget.